"The house is sold. You're homeless now." She said it like she was reading off a grocery list. No drama, no apology, just Patricia Whitmore standing on my own front porch with a stack of divorce papers pressed against her chest, the Colorado wind pushing silver hair across her face, and this expression like she'd been waiting years to say those exact words out loud. And the thing is, I was still smiling. I'd been smiling the whole drive home, one of those embarrassing full-face grins you try to tone down at red lights, because strangers can see you through the windshield. $7 million. My grandmother Eleanor had left me $7 million and her estate in Aspen, and the attorney had shaken my hand that morning with both of his like he genuinely meant it, and I'd spent 40 minutes crying happy tears on I-70, like some fool teenager who just got asked to prom. I kept imagining Daniel's face when I told him. I kept thinking, finally, we can finally breathe. Instead, I pulled into the driveway and found my husband standing beside his mother like a stranger who'd come to repossess furniture. Daniel wouldn't look at me, not once. I remember standing there in the driveway still holding my purse, still in the same blazer I'd worn to the attorney's office, and I'm staring up at both of them, and something is wrong with the porch but I can't place it yet. The flower pots I planted in May were gone. The porch swing Daniel built 10 years ago was gone. Even the curtains had changed. That's when it landed. This hadn't happened suddenly. This had been planned, quietly, carefully, probably for weeks. Patricia stepped down one stair and held the papers out toward me. "You should sign while things are still civil. I almost laughed at that word. Daniel rubbed his forehead like I was exhausting him. "Claire, don't make this harder than it has to be." Harder. I was thinking about the leather folder still sitting in my car, the copy of Eleanor's will, the attorney saying "Congratulations, Mrs. Harper," and meaning it. And here was my husband of 27 years rubbing his forehead at me like I was a problem on a to-do list. 27 years. He drove 6 hours through a snowstorm once to bring me soup when I had pneumonia. I remember thinking that was the kind of man I'd married. Anyway, "You already sold it?" I asked. Daniel nodded once. Patricia smirked. "You always were too trusting." And there it was. Not grief, not guilt, contempt. They thought I was weak, simple. The kind of woman who could be managed, and honestly, until that morning, they probably weren't wrong. Let me back up a little, because you need to understand Patricia before any of the rest of this makes sense. I met that woman when I was 34 years old. She hated me before she ever learned my name. Not openly, not in any way you could actually point to. Patricia Whitmore was too polished for that. Too country club refined. Too experienced at delivering an insult wrapped so tight inside a compliment that you'd be halfway home before you even realized what happened. "Oh, Claire, you're prettier than Daniel's usual type. You're so brave to keep your hair short like that. You've always been so independent. Some men don't love that forever, little cuts." She had an arsenal of them. And Daniel, God, every time she doesn't mean it that way. That became the anthem of our whole marriage. 27 years of she doesn't mean it that way, while I stood there wondering what was wrong with me for hearing what I heard. I don't know. I defended her for a long time. I defended him too. "That's what you did." She questioned every vacation we took, every renovation, every holiday plan. When Daniel's construction business nearly collapsed after the recession, bad contracts, a lawsuit over roofing materials, the whole mess, Patricia suddenly became very involved, helped refinance, helped organize the paperwork, helped Daniel manage accounts. Eleanor noticed immediately. "She inserts herself into your marriage like smoke under a door," she told me once, sitting on her Aspen porch with her tea going cold. I told her she was being paranoid. I was wrong about that. Back on the porch, Patricia glanced toward the street. "You really should leave before the buyers arrive." Buyers. The word floated strangely in my head like it was in a language I almost spoke. Then Daniel finally looked directly at me. "The house sold 3 days ago." 3 days ago I was sitting beside Eleanor's hospital bed, holding her hand while she struggled to breathe. 3 days ago my husband was apparently signing papers behind my back. Something in me should have shattered right then, but strangely, it didn't. Because the moment he said it, another memory surfaced. Eleanor, about 3 months before she got bad, sitting at her kitchen table in Aspen while snow fell outside. She'd put her cup down and said, almost too casual, "Never let other people rush you into signing papers." I'd laughed. "Grandma, you sound paranoid." "No," she said. "I sound old." I thought she was just being careful. General legal wisdom from a woman who'd seen things. Now I wasn't so sure. Patricia shoved the divorce papers toward me again. You can sign now or later. Makes no difference to us. Us, not Daniel. A strange calm settled over me. The kind you get right before a car crash, or right after one. I was never sure which. I looked up at the porch, at my husband, at the woman who'd spent nearly 3 decades trying to quietly erase me from her son's life. Then I smiled. A real one. Daniel frowned immediately. What's so funny? I glanced at the divorce papers, then passed them toward the house. Toward the house Daniel proudly believed he'd just sold, and I said very quietly, actually, the house you sold belonged to. Neither of them spoke. The wind moved through the pine trees above us. Patricia's expression shifted, just slightly, for the first time all afternoon. Confusion. Just a flicker. But enough. I should clarify something about that moment. I wasn't bluffing, but I also wasn't entirely sure yet what I had. I knew enough. The will, the estate, the attorney's handshake, but I didn't yet know all of it. The specifics were still in that leather folder in my car, which I hadn't had time to read properly before I'd pulled into the driveway and found my life rearranged on the front porch. But Daniel knew my face after 27 years together. He knew when I was bullshitting him. And this wasn't bullshitting. Patricia recovered fast, the way she always did. A short, dismissive laugh. Oh, please, don't start with dramatic nonsense. Daniel kept staring at me. I walked slowly toward the porch steps. Patricia moved sideways to block me. You can't go inside. My coat's still in there. We'll ship it. Ship it. Like I was already dead and someone just hadn't told me yet. For 1 second, anger flashed hot through my chest. Not about the house. Not even really about Daniel. About the humiliation of it, that they had planned this carefully enough to pack my belongings before I even got home from the will reading. While I was sitting with my dying grandmother, they were arranging a removal. Daniel spoke again. Claire, maybe we should talk privately. Patricia snapped her head toward him immediately. About what? There it was. She didn't even try to hide it anymore. I stepped back from the porch. That's fine, I said. I don't need the coat. Good. Then she added the line she'd probably rehearsed all afternoon. You should be grateful Daniel is handling this peacefully. Peacefully. I genuinely almost laughed out loud at that. Daniel looked uncomfortable, not guilty, just uncomfortable, like a man realizing a dinner reservation might turn awkward, and that actually hurt more than yelling would've, because once upon a time that man had loved me. I know he did. We met at a 4th of July fundraiser in Denver in 1994. He spilled iced tea all over my white blouse and spent 20 minutes apologizing, then asked me to dinner before the night was over. He had kind eyes back then, warm, the kind that made you feel safe, and he really was safe, for years, until Patricia slowly became the third person in our marriage. The sound of a truck turning onto the street pulled me back. Daniel looked toward the road. A black SUV rolled slowly toward the curb. Patricia's expression changed. That's them, the buyers. I watched Daniel straighten his shirt. Patricia forced a smile onto her face. The SUV parked. 2 men stepped out, one younger, probably an attorney, the other around 70, expensive coat, silver hair, the kind of posture that's only possible in people who've spent decades walking into rooms where they were expected. He looked directly at me first, not at Daniel, not at Patricia, at me. Then he glanced toward the house and said, almost to himself, interesting timing. Daniel stepped forward with his hand out. Daniel Whitmore. We spoke on the phone. The older man shook it briefly. Walter Bishop. Patricia shifted into hostess mode immediately. We're just finishing a family matter. Walter's eyes rested on the divorce papers in Daniel's hand. Yes, he said, I can see that. He turned back to me. You must be Claire. I nodded. He studied me for several seconds, unhurried. Then he said something that changed the entire atmosphere on that porch. Your grandmother spoke very highly of you. Daniel went still. Patricia blinked hard. Walter reached into his coat pocket and removed a folded envelope. Cream-colored. Eleanor's handwriting. I recognized it before I could even read it properly. That particular slant she had, the way the C in Claire always came out slightly oversized. My heart did something strange in my chest. Walter held it between 2 fingers like it was fragile. She asked me to give you this personally, but only under specific circumstances. Nobody spoke. Even Patricia went quiet. Walter continued calmly. She said if this house was ever sold without your full knowledge. He paused. He looked directly at Daniel. There would likely be confusion about ownership. Daniel laughed nervously. What confusion? Walter didn't even glance at him. He handed me the envelope. My hands were trembling a little, which I hadn't expected. I stared at Eleanor's handwriting across the front. For Claire, if Patricia finally gets her way, A cold wave moved through me, not fear, recognition. She knew. Somehow, she knew. Daniel stepped closer. I looked up at him, really looked at the man I'd spent almost 30 years trusting. Then I looked at Patricia, and for the first time since I'd met hers, I saw fear behind her eyes. Real fear, not social embarrassment, not irritation. Fear. Walter's attorney quietly opened a folder. "Before anyone moves into this property," he said calmly, "we should discuss the trust agreement connected to the estate." Trust agreement. Daniel's face lost color instantly. Patricia whispered, "What trust?" And standing there in the driveway with evening shadows stretching across the lawn, I realized my grandmother Eleanor hadn't simply left me money. She'd left me protection. Nobody spoke for a long moment after the words, "trust agreement," landed. The neighborhood felt too quiet all at once. A dog barked somewhere down the block. Mrs. Hargrove across the street was watering her roses very carefully and absolutely pretending not to stare. Daniel swallowed. "I think there's been some misunderstanding." Walter removed his glove slowly. "No, I don't believe there has." Patricia stepped forward with a laugh that sounded like a door with a broken hinge. "This is absurd. Daniel legally owned this property." The younger attorney said, partially. Just that one word. I watched Daniel's face. That single syllable frightened him more than anything else so far. Patricia noticed. She turned toward him sharply. "What does that mean?" Daniel didn't answer. Walter looked at me gently. "Mrs. Harper, would you like to open the letter now?" I nodded. My fingers were still unsteady. The paper smelled faintly of Eleanor's perfume, lavender and cedar. For one painful second, I forgot the house, forgot Daniel, forgot all of it. I was just standing there smelling my grandmother's perfume on a piece of paper she'd sealed before she died, knowing exactly what was coming. I unfolded it. "Claire, if you are reading this, then I was right to worry." I stopped breathing. "You always believed love could fix dishonesty. That was your mother's weakness too." A lump rose in my throat. My mother died when I was 19. Eleanor almost never talked about her directly. I had to look away from the page for a second. I found it again. "Daniel is not an evil man, but weak men become dangerous when stronger people whisper in their ears long enough." I looked up instinctively toward Patricia. She looked furious. "Give me that." Walter's attorney stepped between us. "No." Patricia froze. I don't think anyone had said that word to her in a very long time. Daniel rubbed both hands over his face. "This is insane." "No," Walter said, same calm tone. "What's insane is selling property connected to an active trust without understanding the legal structure." Daniel stared at him. "What trust?" Walter exchanged a glance with the attorney. Then the attorney opened the folder fully. 6 years ago, he explained, Miss Eleanor Bennett quietly transferred a protected ownership percentage connected to this property after assisting with Mr. Whitmore's financial liabilities. 6 years ago, Daniel's construction business had nearly collapsed. Bad contracts, a lawsuit over roofing materials. We almost lost everything. Daniel spent months in a panic. Then suddenly everything stabilized. He told me Patricia had helped arrange financing, but now another memory surfaced. Eleanor calling me late one evening, her voice careful and quiet. "Don't worry about the house," she'd said. I handled it. At the time, I thought she meant emotional support. Now I understood. She literally handled it. She'd put money into saving our house, and in doing so, she'd quietly secured a legal interest in it. And she had never told me. Because she knew if she told me, I would have told Daniel, and Daniel would have told Patricia, and Patricia would have found a way around it. Eleanor played a longer game than any of us. Daniel's face had gone pale. "What percentage?" the attorney answered. "Enough to complicate unauthorized sale proceedings." Patricia exploded. "For God's sake, Daniel, what did you sign? There were hundreds of pages, and you signed them without reading? You told me the refinancing had to happen fast." The silence afterward was almost embarrassing, because suddenly the truth was just standing there naked in front of all of us. They weren't masterminds. They were greedy amateurs who'd underestimated a quiet old woman in Aspen. Patricia pointed at me. "She knew about this." "I didn't," I said, and I truly hadn't, not fully. But Eleanor had. That realization settled deep inside me. She'd spent years watching quietly while Patricia maneuvered through our lives, and she'd planned accordingly. Daniel turned toward me desperately. "Claire, listen, we can figure this out. Interesting. 10 minutes earlier I was homeless. Now suddenly, we existed again." I folded Eleanor's letter carefully. "You already figured things out, Daniel. That's not fair." I laughed softly before I could stop myself. "Not cruelly, just tired. You sold our house while I was burying my grandmother. Patricia jumped in immediately. It was legally his house. Walter finally looked directly at her. No, that assumption may become very expensive. Patricia's face went white. The younger attorney closed the folder. At minimum, the buyers were not informed about active trust entanglements connected to the property. Daniel looked genuinely sick. Walter spoke carefully, almost kindly. My legal team discovered the issue this afternoon during final review. He looked toward Patricia. I'd strongly recommend pausing everything before someone makes this worse. Daniel turned toward me suddenly. You knew this would happen. Why were you smiling? I looked at him for several seconds, because the answer was finally clear. I was smiling because for the first time in years I wasn't trapped. Not financially, not emotionally, not inside a marriage, where every decision passed quietly through Patricia first. That realization felt strange. Painful, but freeing too, like something that had been pressing on my ribs for years had just let go. Walter motioned gently toward the letter still in my hands. There's more. I looked back down and kept reading. Claire, if Patricia is standing nearby while you read this, then I imagine she still believes money makes people powerful. But real power is patience. And people who underestimate quiet women usually regret it eventually. I could practically hear Eleanor's voice in those words. Her particular dry humor. The way she'd pause after a line like that and just wait for it to settle. Patricia looked furious enough to shatter. Daniel suddenly seemed smaller, older, like something had deflated inside him. Walter spoke softly. Your grandmother asked me to help if necessary. Why? I whispered. He smiled sadly. Because she loved you, and that nearly broke me. Not the money, not the house, not the trust agreement or the legal complications, just that. The simple certainty that someone had seen everything happening around me for years and cared enough to prepare for it. Daniel stepped down from the porch. Claire. I held up one hand. He stopped. First time he'd listened in a long time. The hotel lounge Walter suggested was dim and quiet, mostly older couples with early dinners and tourists escaping the cold. He reserved a corner table near the fireplace. His attorney spread documents carefully across the polished wood. Daniel sat beside me automatically. Patricia sat beside him even faster, like she was afraid physical distance might cost her something. I kept Eleanor's letter folded tight in my lap. Walter removed his glasses. Before we continue, I want to clarify something. The sale itself may not be completely invalid. Patricia immediately started to smirk, but he continued. However, depending on intent, disclosure, and timing, several serious legal complications exist. Daniel rubbed his forehead. What complications? The younger attorney answered. Failure to disclose protected trust interests. Potential financial concealment during marital dissolution proceedings. Improper transfer timing. He said it the way you'd read off a parts list. Patricia waved her hand. You lawyers make everything sound dramatic. The attorney looked directly at her. No, ma'am. Courts do. That shut her up for a moment. Walter turned toward me. Claire, your grandmother requested that this second envelope only be opened if you discovered evidence of betrayal involving the property. Second envelope. Of course there was another one. Eleanor always believed important things deserved layers. She once wrapped my Christmas gift inside 5 separate boxes, just because she liked suspense, and she thought it was hilarious every single time. He slid it across the table. I stared at her handwriting again. For Claire, when the truth finally becomes impossible to ignore, my chest hurt reading that, because deep down, I think part of me had always known. Not about the house, not about the divorce, but about Daniel disappearing from our marriage year after year while I pretended not to notice. Inside the envelope, another letter and several photocopied documents. Bank transfers, property records, emails. I looked down at the first sentence. Claire, if you are reading this, then Patricia finally overplayed her hand. Patricia shifted uncomfortably beside Daniel. I read silently for several seconds, then looked up. You used my inheritance from my mother. Daniel blinked. What? You told me we used your savings during the recession. I lifted one of the documents. Patricia leaned forward immediately. Claire, now wait No, that surprised even me. I stared directly at Daniel. You used the money my mother left me. He looked cornered, trapped, like a man who'd finally run out of rooms to move into. It was temporary, he said, barely above a whisper. How much? Silence. How much, Daniel? Finally. Almost all of it. The fireplace crackled softly beside us. Silverware clinked against plates across the lounge, ordinary sounds. Ordinary life continuing while mine quietly cracked open. My mother left me $80,000 when she died. Not enough to change your life, but enough to matter. Enough to remember her by. Daniel reached toward me carefully. I was trying to save the business. Patricia jumped in. And that business fed you for years. Walter calmly slid another document across the table. Actually, the business losses accelerated after several withdrawals connected to Patricia Whitmore's investment accounts. The silence afterward felt enormous. Daniel turned slowly toward his mother. Patricia's face drained pale. What? Walter adjusted the paper slightly. Mrs. Whitmore encouraged several high-risk investments during the same period Mr. Whitmore claimed financial hardship. Daniel stared at her. You said those accounts were protected. Patricia snapped. They were supposed to be. There it was. The truth finally dragging itself into daylight. Daniel wasn't innocent, but he wasn't the architect either. He was just weak. Weak enough to follow the loudest voice in the room for 30 years, and it had cost him everything. And he was only now starting to understand that. Eleanor had seen that years before I did. I looked back down at her letter. You cannot save people who willingly hand their conscience to someone else. A tear slid down my cheek before I could stop it. Not because of the money. Because I suddenly understood how long I'd been fighting alone for a marriage Daniel had stopped protecting years ago. Walter spoke gently. Your grandmother didn't want you destroyed financially after the divorce. Divorce. The word sounded different now. Not like death. Like release. Daniel finally whispered, Claire, I'm sorry. And for the first time all evening, I believed he meant it. But strangely, that didn't change anything. It unraveled fast after that. Daniel reading the documents, his face moving through shock, then confusion, then real anger, not toward her, Patricia crossing her arms, tightening, recalculating, the two of them turning on each other the moment consequences appeared. Grandma Eleanor used to say greed is loyal only until fear arrives. She was right about that too. You moved money out of the business account, Daniel said. It was temporary. He laughed once, a bitter sound. That's what I told Claire. Patricia's eyes narrowed. Don't start me for your decisions. My decisions? You told me Claire would take everything if we waited. I was protecting you. No, he said. You were protecting yourself. That sentence hung over the table for a long moment. Then Patricia tried a different angle. You told me Claire would never know. You said the trust wasn't important. You said the house was safe. You said a lot of things. Each sentence came out harder, years of obedience cracking apart at once. I sat quietly and watched the two people who'd operated like a team for 30 years suddenly turn on each other the moment something went wrong. Walter stood slowly. I think tonight has been emotionally exhausting for everyone. He looked toward me. Claire, my driver can take you to Aspen if you'd like. Patricia laughed coldly. Of course. Send her to her mansion. The insult landed differently now. Underneath the bitterness, I heard envy, real envy, not just irritation. Daniel looked stunned. You're leaving tonight? There's nothing left for me here. The words surprised me with their truth. Not just the house. Denver itself suddenly felt heavy, filled with a version of my life that no longer belonged to me. Daniel stood quickly. Claire, wait. His voice cracked a little. That almost hurt more than everything else, because once I would have stayed. I would have explained, comforted, tried again. That was who I'd trained myself to be. But Eleanor's final gift wasn't money, it was clarity. And clarity changes you permanently. Patricia grabbed Daniel's arm. Let her go. He pulled away from her, for the first time. Patricia blinked like she'd been slapped. Daniel looked at me. Please don't leave like this. I picked up my purse slowly. You already left first. Silence. The kind people remember years later. Outside, cold mountain air filled my lungs. Pine and snow. Walter walked me toward the car. Before I got in, I looked back through the hotel window one last time. Patricia was speaking at Daniel, hard and fast. He wasn't defending her. He wasn't defending himself either. He was just staring at the table like a man finally seeing what his own hands had built and built and built until it fell on him. For the first time in decades, I felt absolutely certain, walking away from something. Walter's driver was quiet, which I was grateful for. I don't remember most of that drive. I remember the highway emptying out as we climbed an elevation, the lights of Denver fading behind us, and at some point I looked down and realized I'd been holding Eleanor's letters against my chest, like they were something that could still keep me warm. I arrived in Aspen a little after 2 a.m. Snow covered the long driveway leading up to Eleanor's estate, turning the whole property silver under the moonlight. Benji was waiting at the gates. He's the caretaker. Quiet older man, been there since before I started visiting as a kid. always wearing this particular canvas jacket no matter the season, the kind with the corduroy collar that's been washed so many times the color's just given up. He opened the gates after Walter called ahead, and when I stepped out of the car he looked at me and said, "Miss Claire, I'm sorry about your grandmother." Those 7 words nearly broke me harder than everything else combined, because for hours, the porch, the hotel, the documents, all of it, nobody had mentioned Eleanor herself. Just money, property, divorce proceedings, ownership percentages, like she was a legal instrument that had finally been executed. But she wasn't paperwork. She was the woman who taught me how to bake peach cobbler when I was 9 years old. The woman who mailed handwritten birthday cards every single year no matter where I lived. The woman who drove 12 hours through a snowstorm after my mother died because she refused to let me grieve alone. And she was gone. I stood there in the driveway and had to breathe for a second. The estate looked exactly the same as always, warm light through the tall windows, smoke rising from the chimney, the porch swing creaking gently in the wind. For one strange second I expected her to open the front door with 2 teacups, asking what took me so long. Instead, just silence. Benji carried my bag inside. I stood in the foyer staring at the wooden staircase. "You should get some sleep," he said. But sleep wasn't possible. Everything inside me still felt rearranged, like furniture that'd been moved 2 inches in every direction. Technically the same room, but you'd walk into the corner of everything. So after Benji went upstairs, I wandered. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked softly. The kitchen smelled faintly of cinnamon. Eleanor's knitted blanket was still folded exactly where she always kept it, near the fireplace, like she'd just stepped out and would be back in a minute to pick it up. It felt less like entering a house and more like entering a memory. I ended up in her study. Dark bookshelves, leather chair, soft jazz records stacked near the window. I don't know why I remembered this, but one of them had a coffee ring on the sleeve, old and faded, and I kept looking at it. Her favorite room in the whole house. She used to say the study was the only room where time slowed down properly. And there, sitting in the center of her desk, was another letter. Of course there was. I laughed quietly to myself, which turned into something wetter than I expected. Even dead, Grandma Eleanor still had perfect timing. I sat down in her chair and opened it. "Claire, if you are reading this from my study, then things became uglier than I hoped." I smiled despite myself. That woman knew everything. First, breathe. You have spent most of your adult life carrying everyone else's emotions before your own. That habit will exhaust you if you let it continue. I leaned back slowly. Outside, snow drifted past the windows. Inside, the house had a quiet I hadn't felt anywhere in years. Not a tense quiet. Not the quiet of a room where someone's about to say something, just honest stillness. You will be tempted to rescue Daniel emotionally. Do not confuse pity with responsibility. That line landed directly in my chest, because she was right. Even after everything, after the house, the papers, the documents showing where my mother's money had gone, part of me had been sitting in that hotel lounge quietly worrying about him. Not romantically, habitually. The way you worry about a problem you've trained yourself to fix for 30 years, whether or not fixing it is actually your job. Women my age were raised to be emotional caretakers. Soothe, repair, absorb damage quietly, and after enough years of doing it, you stop noticing how heavy that's become. You just think it's how you're supposed to feel. I folded the letter slowly and looked around the room, and that's when I noticed something else on the desk. A leather journal, my name written across the front in her handwriting. I opened it carefully. Inside were years of notes, observations, small things Eleanor had seen but never said out loud. Page after page of her neat, slightly forward-leaning script. One entry stopped me cold. Claire apologizes constantly for things that are not her fault. Another. Daniel watches Patricia before answering difficult questions. Another. Claire still believes love means endurance. I closed the journal slowly, because I felt seen, completely seen. And this sounds like something you say, but I mean it. Maybe for the first time in my entire adult life understood. Not managed, not tolerated. Understood. I sat in Eleanor's leather chair for a long time after that. The jazz records, the coffee-ringed sleeve, snow against the windows. I didn't cry again, I just sat there and let it be quiet. Eventually I fell asleep in the chair. By noon the next day, my phone was going off like a car alarm. Daniel, over and over. Voicemails, texts, emails. I ignored all of them until one message finally made me stop. "Please don't let 30 years end like this." I stared at the screen for a long time, then I deleted it. because the truth was our marriage hadn't ended that night on the porch. It had ended slowly, piece by piece. Every time he chose silence over honesty. Every time he let Patricia humiliate me to avoid a fight. Every time I accepted less than basic respect because I'd convinced myself that loyalty required sacrifice. The marriage ending wasn't a single moment. It was 100 small surrenders, and I'd made most of them willingly because I didn't know any other way. That afternoon Walter called. "The buyers froze everything," he said. "Your husband's attorney is requesting negotiations." He caught himself. Sorry, habit. Oddly enough, hearing the word husband now felt unfamiliar. Like clothing that no longer fit quite right, not painful. Joff. The wrong size. Walter hesitated before continuing. "There's something else." "What?" "Patricia hired separate counsel this morning." I closed my eyes slowly. Of course she did. "She's blaming Daniel?" "Yes." I sat beside the fireplace while snow fell heavily outside, and then, unexpectedly, I started laughing. Not cruelly, not hysterically, just tired laughter from a woman finally watching years of manipulation collapse under its own weight. The whole elaborate architecture of it, the insults wrapped in compliments, the trust agreements, the careful timing, and it had come undone in one evening because two greedy people couldn't keep their stories straight under pressure. Walter laughed softly too. "Your grandmother predicted that part exactly. I'm not surprised." We hung up. I walked outside onto the porch wrapped in Eleanor's old wool coat. The mountain air was cold and clean, the kind that stings a little on the way in, and everything looked honest out there. The snow, the pines, the quiet. I wasn't lonely. That surprised me. For years I'd confused companionship with safety, and now that I was genuinely alone for the first time in decades, there was no dread. Just stillness. Real stillness, not the kind you manufacture by keeping busy. I stood there until the sun started dropping behind the mountains and the snow turned gold, and somewhere in that hour, I stopped mourning my marriage. Because I realized I'd actually been grieving it for years already. I just hadn't called it by the right name. 1 year later, I was standing in Eleanor's kitchen watching sunlight come across the mountains when the cobbler timer went off. Blueberry, Eleanor's recipe, though I'd swapped half the sugar for honey because I do that now and she would have had opinions about it. The house smelled like cinnamon and coffee. Peaceful. Warm. Lived in. For a long time I'd expected healing to feel like a scene from a movie. The moment everything clicks, the pain lifts, the music swells. But it didn't happen like that. It arrived quietly, in pieces small enough to miss if you weren't paying attention. The first morning I woke up without anxiety twisting in my stomach, before I was even fully conscious. The first evening I realized I'd gone 3 hours without checking my phone to gauge Daniel's mood. The first holiday dinner, Benji burned the rolls. Nobody criticized the way I laughed, and it didn't even occur to me to wonder if I was being too loud. Tiny freedoms. That's what healing actually was. Tiny freedoms, repeated enough times that they stopped feeling like exceptions and started feeling like a life. Outside, fresh snow drifted across the property while guests arrived for dinner. Nothing extravagant, just people who genuinely liked me. Benji was already arguing with Walter about football before he'd even gotten his coat off. Mary Ann was arranging flowers across the dining table with the particular intensity she brings to anything involving aesthetics, which is everything. Walter set 2 bottles of wine on the counter and immediately started losing the football argument. Normal things, good things. The kind of things I'd spent years believing would happen inside my marriage if I just tried harder. But some homes never become peaceful, and the reason is usually that chaos benefits the people creating it. That lesson took me nearly 60 years to learn. Mary Ann came into the kitchen smiling. "You look lighter." "That obvious?" "Yes." She kissed my cheek before lowering her voice. "Have you heard from Daniel?" I nodded. "Twice, actually. The first letter arrived about 6 months after everything fell apart. Apologies, regret, loneliness, the particular kind that comes from finally understanding what you threw away. The second came just before Christmas, shorter. The apologies were gone, replaced by something quieter. He wrote that Patricia barely spoke to him anymore after the lawsuits began, that several friends had disappeared once the scandal spread through their social circle, that the construction business had eventually collapsed completely under legal debt and public embarrassment. In the final paragraph he wrote, "Your grandmother understood people better than I ever did." I never answered. Not because I hated him. Strangely, I didn't. Time had softened the sharpest parts of the anger. What remained was something quieter than that, A kind of tired acceptance, like recognizing a pattern in something you've already walked away from. Daniel wasn't destroyed by one terrible decision. He was destroyed slowly by years of weakness. And honestly, I was too, just differently. For most of my adult life, I confused self-sacrifice with love. I believed enduring unhappiness made me loyal. I believed keeping the peace made me wise. I believed forgiving endlessly made me strong. But Eleanor understood something I didn't. Love without respect eventually becomes permission, and permission invites mistreatment. She'd known that her whole life. She'd just waited patiently for me to figure it out on my own, and when it became clear I might not figure it out in time, she built me an exit in the shape of an inheritance. From the hallway, Walter announced dramatically, "Bad news. Benji still believes the Broncos can recover next seasons." I laughed harder than I had in years. Real laughter, the kind that rises naturally, doesn't ask for permission first. Walter came into the kitchen smiling. He waited for Marianne to step away, then said quietly, "You know, your grandmother would be very proud of you." That nearly made me cry immediately, not because of the inheritance, not because of the estate, because for the first time, I actually believed it might be true. Dinner that evening stretched for hours. Stories, laughter, old memories cycling through the table like a current. At some point, Mary Ann burned the dinner rolls, and we teased her until she threatened to leave forever. Walter spilled wine on his sweater, which he handled with great dignity. Benji cheated at cards, got caught, and was completely unapologetic about it. Simple things, beautiful things. And sitting there surrounded by that warmth, the real kind, the kind that doesn't require anything from you, I finally understood what Eleanor had actually given me. Not money, not property, not revenge, though I'll admit the timing had a certain elegance to it. She gave me clarity before it was too late to rebuild. That was the real inheritance. Later that night, after everyone left, I went outside onto the porch alone, wrapped in Eleanor's old coat. Snow covered the mountains beneath a clear sky, and Aspen glowed quietly in the valley below, and the world looked soft and honest out there, the way it does sometimes, when the light is right and you're not carrying anything for once. I sat down on the porch swing. Daniel's porch swing, actually. The one he built in our backyard in Denver. Ironically, and I mean genuinely ironically, not the polite version of that word. Walter had tracked it down after the house sale collapsed and had it shipped to Aspen. He thought it was funny. I did too, eventually. I ran my hand along the wood. It had weathered a little. Still solid. For years I thought home was another person. A marriage. A place where someone promised to stay. I really believed that. And then age teaches you the difficult things. That sometimes the people you love most become the people you survive. And sometimes losing the wrong people is the first honest step toward finding peace. I sat there for a long time. The wind moved softly through the pines. Below, the town lights held steady in the dark. And quietly, mostly to myself, I said what I'd been working toward saying for 30 years. For years I begged people to love me the way I deserved. Now I know real love never asks you to shrink first. The wind moved. The pines answered. For the first time in a very long time, I felt completely at home.